this event. My name is Stas. I'm film scholar archivist, Ostrom Fellow, and a pleasure to welcome you to the Ostrom Workshop Research Series. It's like a double feature today, so don't run away longer. I'm also pleased to introduce Ethan Iversen, who will present his talk. It's a very long title. I won't torture you with the title. You can read it. So Ethan is a graduate student in environmental science at here. He studies how indigenous people in Eastern North America, which is kind of Indiana, its definition, helped shape the distribution of certain tree species today. And in his thesis, Ethan focuses on the burr oak. I mean, how like cultivation and trade influence its present-day abundance. Beyond his academic research and career, Ethan is an avid conservationist. Over the past 3 years, he led a research project trying to restore the campus river banks, including planting a lot of burrs. If you ever had a chance to chat with Ethan, you know that his enthusiasm about trees and everything is quite infectious. So if tomorrow morning you suddenly feel an urgent need to plant a tree, you know who way. And we have like 25-30 minutes of presentation, and then we will have a violent discussion. Actual one. So you can.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Oz. Fantastic introduction. Really appreciate it. So thank you all for coming today, especially the fantastic individuals that were in my socio-ecology class that I TA for last semester. Thank you guys for shouting out. Really appreciate it. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about, of course, my favorite tree species that we've already talked about. But even though it is my favorite, it has a fantastic history. And through understanding this tree species, we can understand the deep history of indigenous peoples within Eastern North America and the influence that they have on our forests even today. This is called burr oak savanna in Wisconsin. Okay, so to do this, we need to begin by discussing the indigenous peoples of the Eastern Woodlands. So the region that we are in currently, the national region, is broadly known as the Eastern Temperate Forests or the Eastern Woodlands. So in this region, we have broadleaf deciduous trees, we have fall, we have winter, we don't really have evergreen plants here, and there's a few, but very few, generally deciduous forests. And so it covers basically all areas east of the Mississippi River and extends a little past that into the states adjacent to the Mississippi River. So in this broad region, indigenous peoples have been here for at least 14,000 years. The oldest radiocarbon date is from a rock shelter in Pennsylvania called the Meadowcroft Shelter. So they absolutely could have been here prior to that. That's just the oldest date that we have to this day. So during this long 14,000 year period of history, there were 4 distinct periods. However, these periods also kind of overlap with each other in different regions of Eastern North America, switch between the different periods at different times. So it's more just a general kind of understanding. The Paleo-Indian, the Archaic period, the Woodland, and the Mississippian period. Examples of like a Mississippian period site in Indiana would be Angel Mounds, which we have a fantastic amount of scholarship here at IU, and we've done archaeological excavations there in the early 20th century. And an example of a Woodland period site is at Anderson Mounds, Anderson State Park, Anderson, Indiana. So we have preserved sites of these all across Indiana. Indiana is densely populated with indigenous archaeological sites, which is fantastic. So all of these cultures had a variety of impressive feats of civilization that they accomplished. They established long-distance trade networks, created impressive labor systems to create monumental earthworks, and we'll get into those. And they also domesticated dozens of species of wild plants. Okay, so now that you have an idea of kind of where these different cultures existed within Eastern North America, now I'm going to tell you, at least in the landscape, where you would expect to find them. Where were the dense settlements? Where were the sites they preferred to inhabit? And that would be bluff tops and bottomlands. So a bluff top is an area along a river, just in case anyone doesn't know, that is raised higher above the river. It might be 40 to 50 feet above the river, and it's usually on some kind of rock, right? So some kind of rock that the river was not able to erode. So you have a high point on the river. And these were extremely important. Number one, their proximity to rivers. So of course you have access to transportation routes via riverine corridors. Number two, you're elevated above the waterway, and so that in times of flooding, your settlement or your crops are protected from the floods. Number three, defense. Many of these indigenous archaeological sites, like villages that we have on top of bluffs, have had palisade walls, some side of defense purposes. And so that's why they were so important. And then, of course, also they were adjacent to these waterways, which had the most fertile soils. So the bottomlands are the areas near the bluffs along the river that have, of course, the most fertile soils from all those nutrients that were deposited by rivers over thousands of years. So the riverine corridors in Eastern North America, and specifically areas that have extensive amounts of bluffs along these rivers, are where you find the highest concentration of archaeological sites within the eastern woodlands. And also happen to be where the burrows are found the most, and we'll get into why that is. All right. And so these peoples began domesticating plants approximately 2500 to 1800 BCE. So that's almost 4,000 years ago, essentially. And this is actually right in the lower Ohio Valley. So think kind of southern Indiana, Kentucky, southern Illinois. It's actually one of only 10 places on planet Earth where plants were domesticated totally independently by people. So they discovered basically agriculture, started it themselves. So around that time, they began cultivating domesticated plants. Kind of the one we think of today, at least the one still used in our culture, is actually the sunflower. The reason sunflowers are so giant is because indigenous people selected those sunflowers for their giant seeds, which now we usually only eat in granola or at baseball games, but we're actually an indigenous crop thousands of years ago. So we would not have sunflower seeds for sunflowers without them. Also squash, sumpweed, and a relative of quinoa. So just a few examples of those crops. But around 800 CE, so about 1200 years ago, you have this shift, this transition of indigenous agriculture going from, botanically diverse, think more gardens around villages, to an intensive field system, right? So kind of like the agriculture we see today, right? Large, vast expanses of corn. And by this time period, they had also started using crops that they had received via trade from the American Southwest, the Puebloan peoples, as well as Mesoamerica. So 4,000 years ago, they domesticated their own species, but over time, through those trade networks, they started receiving other species, right? Like I said, from further south, and they started cultivating those. So they actually have their own species that they cultivate themselves, as well as those received in trade. And that's why, when we think about indigenous peoples at colonization, you think about the Pilgrims, Puritan, things like that, corn, beans, and squash. Those are actually relatively new crops for them. They'd only been cultivating those for 800 years. And prior to that, they were focused on cultivating their species that they domesticated themselves that were native to Eastern North America, which is a pretty important point. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the impressive feats of civilization that these peoples accomplished. So intensive agriculturalists and earthwork construction. So rarely did they build in stone. You have a few, like in the Appalachian Mountains, you might find some rock walls where they had abundant amount of stone. But primarily, especially in Indiana and the Midwest, where we don't have a lot of stone outcrops, right? Pretty level terrain. It was primarily done through earthwork construction. So they used earthworks for a large variety of purposes. Sometimes they served as structures for houses, right? So you might have a mound, some sort of earthwork, and then on top of it, you have some kind of structure, either of a high-ranking person or like a sweat lodge or things like that. But they also use earthworks, I would say most impressively, in creating agricultural systems. So like this image right here is a bluff top near Cincinnati, Ohio, where the Great Miami River hits the Ohio River. So just about a mile from the Ohio River. So for decades, this was thought to be some sort of fortified hill, right? Some kind of castle atop this bluff near Cincinnati. But about 10 to 15 years ago, kind of research started to dig a little deeper, and they realized that it's actually an agricultural reservoir. So these earthworks actually hold water on top of this bluff top, and these different gates that they left within their earthwork are sluices, and so the water would collect up here and then run down to their fields. Now, the reason I'm showing this is a great example of kind of due to the state of the ruins of these different archaeological sites when European settlers first arrived here, and we'll get into that. Things were interpreted very poorly, right? This was thought to be some sort of fortified complex, when in reality, it's this fantastic agricultural reservoir system, right, to feed all their crops around it. And so something that looked to be, fortification, right, in reality is like an agricultural site. It's really interesting. So they did this, right? Intensive water management, right? Via earthwork construction, things like this, reservoirs, and their farming practices. So this is from Angel Mounds, which is present day Evansville, Indiana. So Evansville, Indiana, 800 years ago was a walled city of 2,000 Native Americans. Really awesome. And the farming methods they employed, ridge and furrow agriculture, we know this through ground scanning radar, were actually identical to medieval Europe at the time. So identical farming systems, fantastic reservoirs, right, for irrigation systems. In this top right corner, you can't see it super well, but this is see if I can put it. Okay. This is a massive earthwork complex in Newark, Ohio, northeastern Ohio. And it's hard to get the scale from this map, but this is about 3 miles wide. Okay. So we're talking, I mean, these are like megaliths. This was actually constructed to trace the 18.6-year annual lunar cycle. So they're also fantastic at astronomy. Some of their earthworks that they've constructed, this one traces the 18.6-year lunar cycle. Others, you know, line up perfectly for winter solstices and things like that. So also just fantastic knowledge of the stars. And they exhibited that through the earthwork construction. So just, yeah, absolutely fantastic. And then, unfortunately, several things hit these people that, I mean, are really difficult to recover from. So first, around 1300 CE, which is right after kind of the zenith of the indigenous cultures, civilizations, right, largest population densities in Eastern North America, the North American climate began to cool. So this induced shorter crop growing seasons. Of course, as soon as your harvests go down, you have less of a food surplus. Your ability to support large populations in dense settlements declined significantly. During the medieval warm period, which immediately precipitated this period, they were actually able to grow 2 crops of corn in 1 year, which is crazy to think about, right? Starting in March, harvesting in July, planting again, harvesting in fall. So because that climate was so much warmer, their agriculture was right, phenomenal. I mean, literally doubling your yield in corn per year, which is pretty amazing. And this graph just kind of shows those decline in temperatures. So first, you have the Little Ice Age. Then you have the arrival of European colonizers. And so when old world diseases, smallpox, measles, syphilis, all those different things that arrived from Europe, they were devastating, right, culturally, disease-induced mortality. So different cultures within the Eastern United States, they might have been living in, let's say, Indiana at the time, right? But if that disease, reached, let's say, Florida via the Spanish, it very quickly moved through the entire Eastern North America. And so what happened was, prior to European colonizers even reaching Indiana, because the first European didn't reach Indiana until 1683, it was La Salle, and he came down the St. Joseph River near present-day South Bend from Lake Michigan. So basically, you have like this 200-year period following the introduction of disease prior to European colonizers arriving in the interior of Eastern North America, where essentially you have severe decreases in indigenous populations, significant rewilding, right? So if you lose 90 to 95% of your population, you're no longer going to be able to maintain, right, your settlements, your agricultural fields, your orchards, all those different things that were able to support you prior to that. And so that's kind of course, now we know that the United States is not a wilderness, but that is what kind of precipitated that notion, right? That like, oh, this was a complete wilderness, right? Is extremely overgrown, and it would have been to settlers, but underneath all that vegetation, underneath all those trees, underneath all that rewilding, still dense archaeological sites. They just weren't really visible, super visible to them at the time. Okay, and in addition to that, there was wholesale destruction of indigenous archaeological sites in Eastern North America. Unfortunately, once the colonizers came through, they just did not see the value in these sites. This is actually an example of it's called the Big Mound, a massive Native American earthwork that was in present-day St. Louis. And, this is from 1868. They literally just went after it with steam shovels for about a month and just use it as fill for other houses. But I just wanted to use this as an example because so much of the evidence of these dense populations, of these dense settlements, of these impressive, right, earthworks have been destroyed, right? And you read, early accounts from pioneers kind of first tilling the soil in Indiana, Illinois, and you just thousands of arrowheads, thousands of potsherds. I mean, you couldn't even till your field without hitting abundant artifacts. So it's really crazy how much there was, and unfortunately, due to the looting, right, due to the destruction of a lot of these sites, they just no longer are really present. And so that's kind of led to this notion that there wasn't a large amount of human influence on the forest in eastern North America, right? Even though that's not the case. Okay, so we're going to kind of segue just a little bit here. So as I've just given you kind of a background environmental history of Eastern North America, now I want to talk to you about Amazonia. So although Amazonia is very tropical, there's actually a lot of similarities between how the cultures developed within Amazonia and the Eastern temperate forests. Both regions, extremely densely forested regions, relatively low overall topography. I mean, yes, we have the Appalachian Mountains, but west of the Appalachian Mountains, there's not much, right? It's hilly, but you really don't have large geographic barriers to both people and, right, species being able to spread. Number two is that bluff model of riverine settlement. So just as in Eastern North America, where we see the largest indigenous archaeological sites, largest centers on top of bluffs along major rivers, the exact same pattern rings true in the Amazon. Interestingly enough, you think about major cities that we have present in the Midwest today. St. Louis, for instance, built right on top of Cahokia, which was the largest indigenous city ever in North America, 20,000 people. Minneapolis, Minnesota, built on the bluffs of the Minnesota River. Louisville, built on the bluffs of the house. So like a lot of our present, largest cities within Eastern North America are built right on top of bluffs, right on top of the indigenous archaeological sites. So that's also part of the reason why we've lost so many of those sites. Anywho, rings true in Amazon. The construction of earthworks, right? Just in our region, just as in the Amazon, not a lot of stone resources. It was mainly earthworks that were constructed. And there's all kinds of fantastic geoglyphs, there's so many different kinds of earthworks, geoglyphs, right? Agricultural, canals, reservoirs, all those different kind of things. You see very, very similar construction type in both Eastern North America and the Amazonia. And lastly, those long distance trade networks. The trade networks of Eastern North America were extremely vast. You have obsidian from Wyoming, copper from Michigan, being found in the Southeast. So we're talking the moving of trade goods thousands of miles via water transport as well as overland. So just keep that in mind as we go through this with similarities. So Amazonia was once thought to be a relatively pristine ecosystem. I mean, I remember growing up in school, right? It's the Amazon rainforest, right? It's like super dense, right? No humans there. But of course, in recent decades, through amazing technology, we realized that what we thought was a relatively pristine ecosystem has, incredible amounts of human influence, right? Densely populated, and the forests also were highly domesticated. So I've just included a couple of the. Seems like every month we see a new article coming out in a paper about another LiDAR scan, and they found some other ancient city in the Amazon. I mean, it's really fantastic. And so the way we've been able to understand that the forests were domesticated in the Amazon, that there was a vast amount of influence on the tree species composition and structure there, is through these evidence, right? So it's through terra preta, anthropogenic soils, right, that have been amended somehow. They have that black color full of, pottery shards and grave sites and all different kind of things associated with settlements. These earthworks, right? Just like as we have in Eastern North America, we're finding more and more of these earthworks and geoglyphs and these ruins of these massive large settlements underneath the canopy via radar. The presence of hyperdominant tree species. So specific tree species that were extremely valuable to the peoples of Amazonia, the Brazil nut, the rubber tree, that we know they cultivate intentionally, are hyperdominant. So they'll be, pretty much the only tree species that occurs across like vast areas of the Amazon. And so we know through examining that, like, okay, well, this probably didn't occur naturally. So we know there must have been some intensive agroforestry going on there with these hyperdominant tree species. And then, of course, those current indigenous people still residing in the Amazon that have been able to hold on to their lifeways and their culture, more so than the peoples of Eastern North America have been able to, unfortunately, due to, cultural genocide, removal west of the Mississippi River to reservations and those sorts of things. And so the way people were able to domesticate forests in the Amazon, this is from a 2018 paper, is these different management practices, okay? And so I just want to keep these in mind as we go along and think about how these sort of management practices could have been utilized by indigenous peoples in Eastern North America. So, right, and we're just removing, right, if you really want to grow a specific species of tree, right, okay, I'll remove all the other ones around it so it gets the maximum amount of light, it gets the maximum amount of water, and it's not competing for resources. Protection, of course. I cage all my trees. We do that today. attraction of dispersers, right? Transportation of usable plants, which we'll talk about, right? Via trade networks. So, if a certain species of plant or tree isn't native 1,000 miles upriver, but they want to cultivate it, okay, just get in your canoe and go up there and trade some with them, right? Selection of phenotypes. So maybe not fully domesticating a tree species, although that did occur, but specifically picking, I don't know, the oak tree that has the largest acorns, right? And specifically try and cultivate those as opposed to the ones that have smaller acorns. The use of fire to manage forest landscapes. Fire is extremely important. We'll talk about its role in the Eastern North America. Planting of useful plants, okay, of course, and soil improvement, which causes terra preta. So I just want to keep those practices in mind as we go forward, because it's very likely that these practices were also used in Eastern North America. Up to this point, we've really only looked at fire management as far as forests in Eastern North America and being impacted by indigenous peoples. But every single other one of these management practices were likely utilized, and we'll get into the evidence that we have for that. Okay, so now that we've talked about the Amazon and we've compared all those similarities to Eastern North America, now we can start taking a closer look at Eastern North America and our forest composition here. So up to this point, I've talked about how we've really kind of suppressed that rich history of indigenous cultures and civilization in Eastern North America due to all the factors I've talked about so far. And so as an ecologist in Eastern North America, these are the factors that we're thinking about as far as what determines where a tree is found in the landscape. Okay. So climate, soil pH, slope aspect, water availability, fire tolerance, shade tolerance, and disturbance history. So all these factors certainly are important, and they certainly do influence tree species distribution. They fail to take into account the influence that indigenous peoples could have had, that they've lived here for 14,000 years, right? Why aren't they listed in these kind of factors? Because unfortunately, right now, they're not really included in how we think about the full range maps of a lot of these species, even though they've had diverse impacts. And so fire. So in the last few decades, in Eastern North America, fire has become a huge thing, right? Prescribed burning. And the reason for this is a lot of our forests are composed of oak and hickory trees. So these are mass-producing species, long-lived, high-value timber-wise. So, they're valued for a wide variety of purposes, much superior to wildlife versus other species of trees, right? Because they're rich nuts. Very important for pollinators, Lepidoptera species. For instance, like a tulip tree has about 100 different species of moss that need it, right, to as a host plant, whereas the white oak has about 1,200. So just much, much, much more ecological value than other tree species. So now we're getting to the point where we're realizing the importance of fire in maintaining oak and hickory ecosystems because they're very shade intolerant. So if you don't do any kind of active management to an oak hickory forest, it is going to turn into essentially a very dense, low light ecosystem. You kind of lose a lot of your native wildflowers in the understory. Other trees simply can't make it to the overstory because it's so dense. And so they essentially become somewhat unhealthy. They can't support nearly as much wildlife as they did prior to that. And they just aren't nearly as productive. And so that's why indigenous peoples in Eastern North America manage these forests via prescribed fire in order to maintain this. In addition, just to promoting the oak and hickory trees for hunting purposes, right? Sight lines. If someone's trying to attack you, you want to be able to see as far as you can under the understory of the forest. Super dense forest. It's not good for humans. It's not good for wildlife. And so now that we're realizing how important this stuff is, but we're not taking the next step. The current thinking is that, okay, there were oak and hickory forests already. Indigenous peoples came in and they burned it, and they promoted the oak hickory. But did they actually plant the acorn? Right? Did they plant? Was it really them just influencing a tree species composition that was already there, or did they completely kind of start it new? Right? Did they plant those oak and hickory trees? If we know how important they were, why weren't they also actually initiating the establishment of these sites? And that's luckily we're getting there. Okay, so now we're finally to the burr oak tree. Okay, so the burr oak tree, species of white oak. And what makes it so unique, it has the broadest range, okay, of any North American oak. This is hidden, but ranges all the way from northwestern Manitoba, south to Texas, all the way to New Brunswick and Maine. So no other oak species has such a fantastically wide range and can tolerate such a wide range of conditions. And it also has the largest acorn of any species. So they're giant. I would say they're at least 2 to 3 times the size of any other acorn of a native oak. So long-lived, they can live 500 years plus, drought-tolerant, fire-resistant, yet shade intolerant. So they do require some sort of prescribed burning or at least some sort of management in order to make sure they attain their full size and don't get shaded out by other tree species. Now, what's kind of odd about them is although they have this extremely broad, extensive range, that would kind of make you think like, wow, they just must be super competitive. They're able to outcompete anybody, right? They can tolerate all conditions. But that's not the case. They're actually relatively rare in the landscape. So even though in this range map, they can be found in all these areas, it's only in very specific niches and habitat types where they actually occur. These are bluff tops, bottomlands, near natural springs, and just in general, they're never far from water. They kind of just follow these riverine corridors. Like you will never find a bur oak. You won't find a bur oak in Brown County on top of the ridge, right? It's extremely drought tolerant, can tolerate fires. We know those Brown County hills were burned, but why don't we see bur oak there? Also, you don't see it in the Appalachian Mountains, even though it was able, God, you can't see it with this, but even though there are significant populations in northeastern North America, you don't find it anywhere in the Appalachians. So how did it get across that mountain range if it can't even live in the mountains, right? So just a lot of kind of weird things about its range that just don't really add up. So it's like, how did this bur oak cover such an area, but be such a specialist and only be found in like these relatively specific niches? Also, although these aren't very present today, unfortunately, due to habitat conversion, a lot of bur oak savannas were located in where our densest cities are today, as I've talked about, and they occurred in monocultures. So similar kind of hyper dominance to tree species in the Amazon, where like when you do see bur oak, it's very specific, right? They're very rare, but then when you do see them, you see a ton of them. It's just it's kind of an enigma, or is it? Okay. So this is a slightly better map. This is a by county map. So this is showing you the counties in the United States where bur oak has been found with an herbarium record. And as you can see, so yellow means rare in the county, green means somewhat common, but just note yellow and green, it still means it's there. So you can see through the map that there's all these kind of weird, right, 100-mile, 50-mile gaps between different populations of the bur oak throughout its range. And this is very strange. You look at the range map of white oak or red oak, which are like two of our most common oaks, and they simply don't have a range like that. It's much more continuous. They don't have these wide gaps between populations. And also they don't extend nearly as far as the bur oak is able to, as far as toleration of such a wide kind of range of places where it can exist. And also it's like, okay, if it can tolerate Alabama and Mississippi, then why can't it exist in Georgia and South Carolina, right? What are the factors limiting this species if it's able to tolerate such a wide range of conditions and has such a broad range map? And so this brings me to my research question. How have 10,000 years of indigenous management and inhabitation within Eastern North America impacted the relative abundance and distribution of the bur oak today? Okay, so unfortunately, we have to work backwards in Eastern North America. The reason I use that Amazonian example of comparison is because so much of the evidence in the Amazon is still there, right? The forests haven't all been cleared. We can do these LiDAR scans of these essentially old growth forests. I mean, yes, they're highly managed by humans, but still old growth in the sense that they haven't been managed a lot in recent decades. Unfortunately, in Indiana and much of the Eastern North America, right, utter destruction of forest lands. Indiana was down to about 4% forest cover in the early 1900s. So, I mean, and destruction of forests, destruction of the indigenous peoples, removal west of the Mississippi River, destruction of archaeological sites, building our own settlements right on top of them. It's destroyed a lot of the evidence. But we can work backwards. And so this is what I'm doing with the bur oak. So these are just some of the methods that I'm using to kind of tease out how indigenous peoples influence the bur oak. So accounts of early settlers, herbarium records, archaeological evidence, historic land office records from the government, genetic evidence, pollen records. Pollen records are tough because bur oak cannot be distinguished from white oak and pollen records. It's just all the same. So it can kind of help you, but I can't distinguish bur oak specifically. Current landscape surveys on the landscape, and then the oral histories of indigenous peoples. Okay, so we'll start with the importance of bur oak to indigenous peoples. So this is a quote from 1807 from Benjamin Barton, friend of Lewis and Clark, went on an expedition just a few years after them using their maps and a lot of their information. And he talks about how the acorn of a variety of bur oak is one of the most principal nutritious articles of Indian tribes in the trans-Mississippi part of the United States. In pursuit of this vegetable, Indians are accustomed to making regular migrations of 100 miles. So he talks about just how important it is to those people. And I also think it's very interesting that he refers to the acorns as a vegetable, cultivation of vegetable. So we know acorns were harvested by indigenous peoples who processed them by leaching their tannins, and they would grind those acorns into flour. They would make acorn mush, similar to oatmeal out of them, breads and soups. But what really made the acorn so important is that they are able to store for very long periods of time. So you think about like wheat or barley or millet in medieval Europe, right? And that was pretty much what everybody's eating gruel. You think about Eastern North America, the acorns, that was like their staple grain in a sense. So they could be stored for very long periods of time in purpose-built granaries. So even if you had a time of hardship or your annual crops, which we spoke about earlier, say your corn all fails, at least you have those acorns to get you through the winter, that unperishable food that's able to get you through the winter. So very important.
Thinking about long periods of time, we kind of
sorry. We're getting there. Sorry. Thank you.
No, just like try to summarize in a way.
Okay. Now we're getting to the good stuff. How are we helping? It's not good to read my quotes.
Scroll right at the top of it.
Oh, yeah. Oh, Jen. Okay. You find out you're doing this. Sorry.
Yeah, go back.
Whether
What do we click on that? Okay,
No.
where's this share? Where's it sharing from? It's not even acknowledging that.
Right. Right over it, you can turn it into a bar.
There it is. Okay,
Okay.
sorry.
Thin bar on the left. Yep.
Much.
Sorry.
I appreciate it. Ask.
So many of us need to figure that.
Okay, so first we're going to look at association of Baroque with archaeological sites in the historic record. So I mentioned Cahokia earlier with you, the largest indigenous city yet found, 20,000 people at its peak, also the largest earthen pyramid north of Mexico. And so we look in 1927, it's called Monk's Mound. What do we see growing on top of Monk's Mound? A Baroque 4 feet and 4 inches in diameter, right on top of the mound. 1872, a large shell mound opposite the ruins of a massive indigenous earthwork. I see that now they're going upon it, a Baroque tree fully 6 feet in diameter. So we see when these early European explorers and archaeologists are like exploring these ruins that they notice over and over again that Baroques are covering these archaeological sites. Once again, 1861, Sauk County, Wisconsin. Antiquity of the works at Racine, Wisconsin, built right on top of an indigenous archaeological site. Shocker. There was a Baroque stump counted and contained 250 rings, and the tree was cut 10 year cents, right there. Father of the Iowa archaeology, 1927, he noticed a number of old villages were situated in Baroque groves on lake margins, and even noticed that the great Baroque tree was still used as a burial tree when the first settlers entered the region. And so we see that Baroques are occurring all over these archaeological sites. And you think about it, when these sites were abandoned, you would normally expect, coming on like super fast growing wind dispersed tree species to colonize these sites, right? Maybe a cottonwood, maybe a sycamore. Baroques with their giant acorns, they have to be essentially carried by a squirrel or humans in order to continue to grow. So the fact that we see Baroques just all over the archaeological sites, you would not see that today. If there was a site that was abandoned, you would see, like I said, less quality trees that spread via wind and not high quality oak species. And now we're going to look at the hyperdominant. So the hyperdominant has not been used to describe Baroque stands in the United States up to this point, but it's kind of fascinating. We should use that term. So this is specifically, I thought an Indiana example would be cool. So Marshall County, it's in northwestern Indiana. In 1835, they allowed all those lands to be for sale in that county, right? It's kind of like, okay, now it's time. You can buy up all the land once the Native Americans are removed. And it's fascinating. The first lands that speculators went after were these Baroque flats, okay? And oh, look, Indian mounds near the lake on the farm on these Baroque flats. And this is really interesting, right? The fine men of the town built this beautiful kind of country house looking out over the Baroque flats. So the value of these lands that Baroque occurred on is very clear to the early pioneers. You can tell how much they valued it. And they also acknowledged how high quality the soil was, specifically of the Baroque lands, and how that apparently there was some sort of intermixture of lime into the soil of the Baroque lands. Extremely productive and regarded by farmers as superior to all other classes of soil. So it's interesting how valued these Baroque lands were. And the terminology is also fascinating. So today we would call it a Baroque savanna. There are a few Baroque savannas that remain, which basically is think of open understory and then giant Baroques in the overstory. Okay. But they didn't use that terminology back in the day. They had a lot of different terminology. Baroque flats, Baroque land. So they obviously recognize this as like kind of its own specific ecosystem, unlike the rest of the forest. And it goes on, right? In the hickory and Baroque barrens, the soil turns black and seems to become richer the longer it is farmed. Barrens is another term that was used, which is funny because it implies that it's not fertile, but the reason they used it is just because there was nothing else besides the bur oaks. But a kind of bur oak barrens, right, or openings having some resemblance to old orchards. And once again, how the pioneers and early Europeans distinguish the bur oak plains from other types of oak openings, which are basically other types of oak savannas. They even differentiate them from those. The difference is the character of the trees and the evenness of the surface. Right, they have the appearance of cultivated orchards or English parts, and they even mentioned like a carriage and four could easily pass through. Right, so very open, possibly orchards. Right, extremely rich, highly desired by settlers. And then we also see all across the Midwest, unfortunately, there's very few of these remaining today, but there are raised indigenous garden beds. And just recently, we're starting to use LIDAR within the Eastern North America to identify more of these. Just a huge patch in like the southeastern Upper Peninsula of Michigan was just found. Really, really cool. But so this is from 18. Well, this guy's writing in 1878, but in 1832, right, they get into Michigan and they drew these fantastic ancient garden plots that were just there when they got there. And you can even see how they notice a bur oak is conspicuously placed right in the center of this garden plot with the circle. Wow, it's really interesting. Talk about how the ancient garden plots surrounded by bur oak plain. Another term we see: bur oak flats, bur oak barrens, bur oak plain. Just a plain of bur oaks over the stretch of land on which bur oaks occasionally grew, not unlike trees in an orchard, past the deep, well-worn trail connecting to Indian villages. So the proximity of these bur oak plains, bur oak orchards, right, bur oak barrens to indigenous both agricultural systems as well as village sites is very clear in the historic record. So now what I'm doing, so that was examining bur oak populations that are within kind of like the heart of its range, and now I'm starting to look at disjunct populations. So these are populations of bur oak that I said, like at the beginning, you might have 100 miles of space between it and the nearest population closer to the heart of its range. And so in New Brunswick, really good data on how bur oak populations are associated with Maliseet communities within New Brunswick. So once again, associated with the indigenous archaeological sites. And this is 100 to 150 miles away from the nearest populations within Maine. And so as I continue to go in my research, I'm going to find more of these disjunct populations and attribute them to indigenous peoples. So I think that's a really good point to make. It's interesting, the association within the range, but to really show that they expanded the range, I'm going to need to focus on these disjuncts, and that's what I'm doing right now. Okay, so to finish it up, so historically, we looked at the Eastern agricultural complex, right? And we focused kind of solely on the annuals as far as indigenous peoples cultivating plants in Eastern North America. But in reality, it was likely an agroforestry complex. So of course, I mean, if you're going to be cultivating annual crops, just today, right? We have agriculture, we also have silviculture. They likely had a suite of tree crops they cultivated in orchards adjacent to annual crops. We've just kind of overlooked this. I've explained through the bur oaks, right? We have all these different kind of terms for bur oak savannas, right? These open areas with bur oak that might be orchards, but we haven't really thought about whether they were intentionally cultivated, right? And they were dispersed via these trade networks. So just thinking about how humans, indigenous peoples within Eastern North America could have influenced this range over thousands of years. And so, yeah, while bur oak is one example of a species whose range was likely influenced, there are many other examples I'm kind of working on. I'm just starting with the bur oak, so I think I have the strongest case for it, but there's certainly Kentucky coffee tree, shellbark hickory, and Mexican palmer, just a few examples. There are other examples as well. So thank you. So that was all.
Thanks. We have 20 minutes left.
Okay.
We have to be very precise because we have another speaker up. So, floor is open. We have this weird reversed hierarchy: students first, respectable scholars second. So, respectable students first.
Where do we come up? Unrespectable.
We all respect them. No unrespectful in this room.
Thank you. For this, I'll say beautiful, and also I like your energy actually. Stage as a young scholar. I just wonder. This is the one thing actually I try to understand from my like research background. And you use methods those are all data collection tools. Do you have, because lots of like different kind of concepts there I see, and I didn't understand the conceptualization, like interpretation. I think this is ongoing project as I understand. And I just wonder what kind of analysis are you planning to use? Because you have lots of tools, like you said, generic evidence and like historical, I think the records and lots of things I see really huge because my project similar, really broad project. I just wonder what kind of analysis are you planning to use for your research?
Yeah, so I guess I'm trying to look for examples where the ecology, right, the natural explanation of where the bur oak is or what its genetics are, anything like that, kind of don't match. So I would, but as very long as it is, but like bur oak genetics, we're looking at the genetics of bur oaks. They kind of don't match in the sense that a bur oak, there's a study in Illinois, a bur oak might be more similar to a bur oak that's found 200 miles north than it is to like its nearest neighbor within like a bur oak savanna. So genetic discrepancies where it's like, okay, we don't understand how the population genetics of this tree were formed, right, without it taking into humans into account. That's just one example.
Observation and narratives, like. No, I try to understand the analysis part because just based on like observations and also narratives, historical narratives.
Yeah, like a lot of the historical sources I use today, it's kind of reinterpreting historical sources, looking at them like we haven't before. So like I've talked about how like bur oak savannas are a present ecosystem that we have, but are very rare because a lot of them have been destroyed. And when we look at like the historical record and say, oh my God, right? 5 or 6 different terms for these bur oak savannas, bur oak lands, bur oak orchards, bur oak barrens, bur oak flats. So just kind of looking at those historical sources, because that's the best descriptions we have of these ecosystems before they were destroyed, unfortunately. That's the earliest kind of written evidence we have.
I have to actually tell everyone here, you reminded me Henry David Thoreau in as a like 21st century Z generation Henry David Thoreau. You might be better, I don't know, but kind of like you're actually inspired everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Presentation again.
Thank you so much. Patricia?
Hi. Thank you for your presentation. It's quite interesting, and for me it's learning about these indigenous people in North America, and also I think it's very provocative, your comparison with the Amazonian area. And I think at the end you are trying to show the indigenous knowledge, probably that, they have to, in order to manage this tree. And then my question is, if you have some evidence, some information of the forest management that they have, because probably you'll find some issues regarding the management that at the end with this agroforestry perspective. This is one question. And the second, if you have seen also evidence about the fauna and other species, and if they contributed, especially fauna, to the spread of this seed over this area.
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question. What's weird about the bur oak, so the main dispersers of acorns in East North America are, blue jays, birds that can fit acorns in their mouth. The bur oak acorn cannot fit in the mouth of any bird because it's so large. Or essentially, right, squirrels, right, different rodents. And so what's interesting is that because the bur oak it occurs so far north, it occurs further north than any other oak species in Eastern North America, all the way into Manitoba. The likelihood that a squirrel or squirrels, right, without humans would be able to carry those nuts all the way, 3,000 miles north when the glaciers only receded from that area, we'll say 6,000-7,000 years ago. That's what kind of, I guess, leads me to think it's humans. So that I guess it's right. There are some animals, like I said, I guess it would just be squirrels because the acorns can't fit in the mouth of birds. So it could have been, it could have been squirrels. I don't think so. But
the forest management.
Oh yeah, forest management. So I guess I talked about prescribed burning. So we have early accounts of indigenous peoples, burning these oak savannas. I have not been able to find anything as far as them intentionally planting them. So that's why I'm, I can't really necessarily prove it, and that's why I'm trying to rely on all these other different sources to kind of say like, okay, like, yeah, but mainly burning.
From my understanding, and it's a kind of a follow-up of Aisha's on, you're describing basically what in human populations would be a founder effect, right? Where you have an expected migration where you would think that the burr oaks genetics mutate relative to the distance, and you find like skips in the pattern that don't follow, and then basically you run like, well, the chances that it was squirrels, you would see a straight like deviation from the one here to the furthest ones that would be gradual versus a full skip, and that would lead you to think it likely wasn't a squirrel. And then the challenge there would be like, could you quantify that in like a confidence interval type of like, what is the likelihood that it was or wasn't?
Yeah, that would be fantastic if I could do that. I will say burro kind of has been an understudied species just in general. It doesn't take precedence because I've talked about it's relatively rare, even though it has such a broad range amount. So there aren't a ton of genetic papers on it. The one I mentioned to you where they kind of found those discrepancies, like they don't even talk about in their paper. Nowhere in it does it say, oh, we think it could have been humans that caused. They're just kind of leaving it open, like we don't really know what caused these. So I would like to get more genetic papers that I can find specifically on burr oak, and especially comparing this to other species of white oak, because it is genetically fairly similar to other species of white oak, but it's distinct and like I told you earlier, like where it just doesn't make sense.
Wait a second, I'm a moderator.
So disrespectful of me, I'm sorry.
Has an information online, and then we have.
We're having a non-respectful scholar.
Generating a lot of interest. That's the important point here. One second, I say, your energy is really contagious. It's really great to see such enthusiasm in research. You do a great job. So I only have just comments more than a question. So your big conversation is with ecologists, biologists, and forest ecologists, right? Where I think the general agreement there is that the distribution of this tree is due to disturbance from fires. So that's what is established, and so that's you're talking to them, right? You're getting this alternative perspective. So it could be useful, if you perhaps create a list or a table or something with, what are the features that biologists and ecologists, have that really shows the distribution of oak due to fire disturbance. And then how your source of evidence, is sort of arguing or contrasting with those, established knowledge about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like you're producing a thesis to complement or to counter this natural distribution based on fire disturbance. So maybe just having the elements that you have to show evidence, to sort of have a strong argument would be useful, I think. The second thing, I think, as an illustration, it would be nice to have a kind of an ethnobotany of the burr oak. In different ways that it's used for what. So I think that would complement very nicely. Yeah. And then there's one small comment on your Amazonian comment, and I think is the concept of a hyperdominant.
Yes.
So I think there are many cases of hyperdominant forest in the species in the Amazon. The two species that you showed, I wouldn't say that they are features, they're hyperdominant.
Okay.
Compared to other species that are hyperdominant. So what they are, I don't know what's the exactly technical term here, they're widely distributed. So you find it everywhere. But hyperdominant in the case of the Amazon represents a very high density of the same species dominating a forest, which is not the case for the Brazil nut tree or for the rubber tree. They are distributed in kind of low density, but very wide. So it's just that the
Question for you. I think I've struggled with like scale, because even these, I guess the bur oak, even if it's only 200 acres, if they're the only tree species occurring in that area, would you still consider them hyperdominant, even though it's not over a very vast scale? Because I guess that's what I'm kind of like, how, I guess, you know what I mean, how vast of an area of hyperdominant trees does it have to be considered? You know what I'm
It
saying?
depends where you know, I mean, in that case, it seems like an island of, burr oak in a savanna landscape. I think that's different than hyperdominance. You know, hyperdominance in the sense of the Amazon, there are several species that are hyperdominant. But that means that they take, 50 to 60% of the abundance in a given forest, so that species occurs like in a high number. And those two species occur in low number, but very widely. It's very important, but it's just the term hyperdominant.
Thank you. What I was trying to go for that is like bur oak savannas, they're the only tree species that occurs. There are no other tree species that occur in a bur oak savanna. So that's where I was coming from.
Yeah, in that case, they are.
Okay.
Yeah, but I mean, just examples that you use for Amazonia.
Those aren't the best.
Yeah, they're not the best.
Thank you.
Yeah, we had an online question, but I can read it, or do you want to ask it? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, Bernie.
Hello there.
I
So
think you're muted. Okay.
I should not be muted now, I'm okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So the question that I've had is, you say that you think the bur oak were planted, but were they planted for a crop because they take so long before, we're talking 30, 40 years before a tree may produce nuts. Were they planted more for a symbolic or some other kind of reason? And that's going to be hard to determine. But I just wonder about the cropping because, they're a slow growing tree. And by the way, you are very correct. There's very little research in the ecological literature on bur oak. So you're in a field where there's not a lot of work been done. But I just wonder if it was actually a crop.
Okay. Thank you, Bernie. I think although it takes 35 to 40 years for a bur oak to reproduce, maybe in a denser stand with partial shade, I think if they're growing them out in a field where each of those trees pretty much has, we'll say close to 100% sunlight. I know oak species can reproduce a lot earlier if they get more sun, if they're more open grown. So I'm thinking that might be a little faster than the 35 to 40 years if they're intentionally cultivating them and giving them full sun. That is a fair point. It certainly would have been an investment. I mean, it absolutely was an investment. And like I spoke out earlier, they were often used as like a backup crop. So if your annual crops failed, these last a very long time and you're able to store them. They're not very perishable. And so they, kind of serve as a resource in that way. But yes, it would have taken a decent amount of time for them to set fruit.
It's my turn now. All right, so I'm going to jump on a gap, and I might be incorrect in my assumption, but I'm assuming that there's a big gap in the record of you trying to trace it that might explain why sometimes there's 100-mile gap between trees that are genetically similar, just because, as you said, in Indiana alone, we got down to like 4% forest cover. So that's obviously like a complete erasure of the record. And we actually went to this talk last semester that was really interesting about something somebody called the attic archive, I think is what he called it. And he was studying ivory in people's attics. And I wondered if there was a way to fill gaps. And this is probably a way huger project than what you're working on, but fill gaps from other kinds of records. So like if bur oaks are prized for their ability to produce good solid furniture that lasts a long time, can you actually explore this as a way of filling the big gap record and see, oh no, this did travel organically this way, but people just harvested it and made furniture out of it. And now there's a large concentration of bur oak furniture that is like the same sort of DNA record. And that kind of helps you map it. Or are there still big gaps there because these are still not aligned?
So you're saying by knowing that bur oaks were, I guess, logged somewhere, even if they're not there today, that's the way of filling in the gap.
Yeah, there's like maybe other
That's what you're
forms
saying now.
you could explore.
Yeah, I've come across in the literature, for instance, the disjunct I talked about in New Brunswick, because it was the only oak species there, right? Absolutely, all the bur oaks were cut first when the settlers got there, because that was the highest quality wood compared to the other stuff they had around there. Luckily, there are still a few sites that they were able to see, but no, I talked about the rewilding of the landscape, right? Once you have these populations massively decline, so during that period, a lot of bur oak orchards, savannas probably disappeared. They're probably outcompeted because they were no longer being managed by indigenous peoples. No prescribed fire was no longer a thing. And I think that's probably a good part of the reason why that the distribution is so patchy in the southeast. Or at least that's one of my theories, because all of the populations that are still there correlate with archaeological sites, right? Why aren't they in Georgia? Why aren't they in South Carolina? Why aren't they also other places? That's where the disease reached first through Hernando de Soto's expedition, and also just tree growth rates and decomposition rates are so much higher in the southeast and the Midwest because it's subtropical climate. It's crazy how much stuff. So that's my theory. Again, that's who knows, but that could be. Whereas bur oaks, let's say in Minnesota, because the climate is so much colder and they're much more adapted, right, to that drought tolerant, they can tolerate really cold things. They've been able to persist. But whereas if they were planted in Georgia, after 100 years, they're probably gone because the southern pines come in, shade them out, and they're gone. Oh, that's weird too. Like, yeah.
So there was so much information here. It was amazing. No, it was great. And I think a couple of things just to think about is maybe sort of organizing it in ways that signal to your audience sort of what you're doing in each section, especially things like, the Amazon is super interesting. But at the moment, it's not entirely like you sort of mentioned, it's because there's some similar in terms of like riverine bluffs and these sorts of things. But from a reviewer perspective, you're going to need a much stronger justification for looking there. And so I think organizing kinds of evidence you have, how it compares to existing theories, and being really cool when you're doing that. And then saying, for example, here is another region where sort of similar kinds of things, and these are the kinds of practices that we might have expected, would be just a helpful way to organize it for audience and for potential reviewers. And then one question I had is whether any Indigenous communities that have relevant oral histories that would be able to some of these questions, right? So like, we know that there's so much ecological, social information that is held and maintained through intergenerational communication. And I'm sort of wondering if there's any plans or opportunities, and maybe it's not possible given the particular communities that were likely to cultivated the bur oak, but I'm just curious if that's something that you've looked into yet.
Okay, so first question, and I want your guys' opinion on this, I guess, because the bluff tops and the riverine distribution I've talked about, I mean, it's an Eastern North American thing. We just also see it in the Amazon. So if my argument is stronger without even talking about the Amazon, I could, I guess I'm just trying to show that it occurs in other places around the world, but I could just totally focus my argument on, no, look, this is what it was in Eastern North America, and not even talk about them. If you know what I mean?
I think all the knowledge that you have is fantastic. You want to organize it in the strongest possible argument. And so when someone says, hey, does this exist somewhere else? You're like, you know what? I can speak to that because I have done my research and I'm super excited about this stuff. But I think that you so much here.
And as far as my struggle is, bur oak is not differentiated from white oak often in these oral histories. So that's what's difficult because, like I said, it's its own thing, right? It's very rare. So like of course, they'll talk about red oak acorns, they'll talk about white oak, but like I have that historical quote from 1807. It's very difficult to find a quote specifically referencing burr and not just white oak or some other species of oak. But still, I would like to reach out and see if I can tease out, someone specifically talking about burr oak.
Are the mounds all georeferenced, just out of curiosity?
Like, do we have current data, like where they're at?
And I think getting to Jorge's point about sort of some probability estimate of like, what is the probability you would see a bur oak without a mound nearby, for example? Kind of an interesting estimate to do.
It'd be amazing.
It's curious. Anyway.
The last one. And Eric, sorry, we don't have time left for one question.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's such a fascinating project. I'm just like super, super impressed because you're going across the aisle to kind of talk to social scientists and and scientist, and your methodology also kind of represents this eclectic mix of different things. I'm just thinking of the story that you're telling and what are the political stakes of that story, right? So, there's the story you're telling is that, look, there's a settler ecology that kind of erases indigenous ecology or ecological practice, and there's a way to find that out, right? And of course, there's a huge political stake here too, kind of how we can revive indigenous knowledge that can, one way or the other, kind of address to or can tell a different history of the landscape. But there's like a simplification happening too here. Like, there's a settler, there are like two larger categories, settler and indigenous, right? So like within, I was just wondering like if like you accessed some of oral histories and found out like if there were like differences within indigenous management of forests, right? So like one community at a particular place had a different style or different relationship with managing them. And then I also like, kind of piggybacking on Jess's question, like I didn't see oral history coming through this presentation. And I was just wondering like how much would that be part of your narrative? But fascinating project, and thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much. So I guess the reason I've chosen burr oak is because, there's 150 species of oak native to North America, right? So indigenous peoples in different parts of the continent, I apologize for oversimplifying, are cultivating the oak species that they likely found around their area, right? That are native to there. What's weird about the burr oak is, number one, it has the largest acorn, right? So no matter what kind of acorns you're normally eating or what kind of acorns you're growing anywhere in East North America, this tree is going to be one you want because it has the biggest acorn. And this is how you maximize your production of acorns. So that's why it's like, no matter where you're at, as long as the burr oak can grow there, those people's likely would have wanted to cultivate it and would have wanted to acquire it. That's where I'm getting at with that. But yes, I need to get more focused.
It's not a given though, right? Just because it's the biggest, right? Like it could have characteristics that would make it totally unwanted, whether it's drier or harder to break up or has a bad flavor or doesn't work very well as a porridge or something like that, right? So I would just, be careful on some of the assumptions. Not that I know anything about how acorns taste.
So fair. Yes.
Wonderful. You have
Thank you,
connected
Scott.
everyone. A lot of great questions, useful comments. Thank you.
Thank you.